The first sound was not the guns, but the hooves. On the high spine of the Italian mountains, where the rock was slick with frozen mist and the wind came in thin, icy threads, a line of dark shapes picked their way along a ridge barely wider than a village road. The sky was the color of wet steel, the valley below washed in the dull gray of pre-dawn, every contour softened by fog. From a distance, they could have been pilgrims, or shepherds, or ghosts returning to the front. Only when the wind shifted did the jingling start to stand out, the faint metallic chime of harness buckles, the dull knock of horseshoes, the scrape of iron-shod hooves against stone, all of it wrapped in the soft, rhythmic huff of animals that had been climbing all night. Sergeant Daniel Harker stood with one gloved hand on a mule's neck and watched his breath boil out into the cold air. He felt the animal's hide shudder under his palm, damp with sweat despite the altitude, ribs pumping steadily as it leaned into the slope. Straps creaked. Somewhere behind him, a man muttered a curse as a boot slipped. Stones cascaded into the darkness, and for a moment, everyone froze, listening for the echo of a shout from below that never came. The Germans were down there, in the fog and the woods and the stone bunkers dug into terraces, and the whole point of this insane climb was that they didn't know. Not yet. The mule shook its ears, the long load of a gun barrel section shifting on its back. "Easy, Rosie," Harker murmured, though the animal could not hear the words over the wind. He patted the warm neck, smelling the mix of wet fur, leather, and the faint sour sharpness of manure that clung to everything in the column. Behind him, another mule snorted, complaining under its burden of crates, shells, fuses, powder bags. Harker could feel the ridge narrowing, not just under his boots but in his chest. 5 more turns along this cliffside trail, then the ledge, then the emplacement, then the moment when all this sweat and risk and swearing would resolve into the hard geometry of firing tables and target coordinates and explosive force. "Sergeant," came a low voice behind him. Private Korski, from Detroit by way of Poland, hunched under his pack and the weight of a tripod section. "How much further?" Harker didn't turn. "Till I say stop," he answered, and some of the men behind him chuckled weakly. The joke was worn thin from use, but in a night like this, even a frayed line was something to hold. Far down in the valley, beyond the curtain of fog, a single yellow pinprick gleamed and vanished. A cigarette in a bunker slit, a careless ember. Harker's jaw tightened. He could almost see them in his mind, the German officers in their clean coats, standing beside maps and kerosene lamps, confident behind their spiderweb of trenches and machine gun nests, certain that the high ground was theirs because no one could put serious guns up on these damned mountains. No trucks, no tanks, just mules. He would have laughed too, Harker thought, if he were down there in their polished boots, looking up. The first time he had heard them laugh, it had been months earlier, in a different valley. It had been late autumn, 1943, when the fields still smelled faintly of crushed grapes and wet earth, and the hillsides were streaked with smoke from farmhouses and burning haystacks. The Americans and British had been in Italy long enough for the dust of the landings to settle into mud, long enough for the initial optimism to be replaced by a heavy, grinding fatigue that clung like clay to their boots. What had looked on a map like a boot-shaped highway to Central Europe had turned out to be a vertical maze of ridges, ravines, and stone villages clinging to slopes like barnacles. German engineers had turned each fold of land into a trap. Roads were cratered, bridges blown, culverts packed with explosives. Tanks bogged down in shell-pocked fields, or found themselves staring at stone terraces that might as well have been castle walls. Trucks, when they could move at all, shuddered under mortar fire funneled along predictable routes. Above it all, on spurs and peaks and saddlebacks, German artillery watched the valleys like vultures. Harker had been there the day one of those German officers christened the mule trains. It was near a town whose name he never learned to pronounce correctly. They had paused in an orchard, the air smelling of rot and smoke and the sharp sweetness of crushed apples hidden in the mud. The mule train, his battery's lifeline, was spread along the road like a broken necklace, animals steaming in the cold, drivers checking loads, a few men squatting by the ditch to smoke. The hush between shellings hung over them. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang once, thin and lonely. "Look at that," said Captain Ellerby, nodding toward a rise beyond the orchard wall. "Company's coming." On the far slope, German officers stood in a loose cluster on a cleared patch of earth beside a line of their own guns. They were small at that distance, gray and green figures against the brown hillside. One of them had binoculars slung low on his chest. Another rested a boot on a wooden crate. Even at that range, Harker could feel the air of relaxed superiority as they turned their heads toward the road. One raised an arm, pointing. Another doubled over, laughing, shoulders shaking. Harker followed the line of the gesture and saw what they saw. His column of mules, plodding through the mud with their sagging loads, ears flicking. A third German officer clapped his hands, miming the slapping of flanks, and pretended to bray. The others laughed harder. A soldier behind them, helmet pushed back, cupped his hands to his mouth and gave a loud, mocking hee-haw that carried faintly across the valley. The word reached them like an echo. "Esel," murmured one of the drivers, who had worked with German prisoners in North Africa. "Donkeys. Take a picture, you sons of," muttered Korsky. But there was nothing to do. They were out of range. This was not the time. Captain Ellerby only watched, jaw muscles twitching, while the Germans finished their show. After a moment, one of the officers put his boot back on the crate. Another lifted his binoculars, and their attention slid away. Back to the more serious business of scanning the valley for targets that mattered. Trucks, guns, tanks, not mules. It made a certain kind of cold sense. On a modern battlefield where steel and gasoline defined power, animals looked like relics. Mules belonged on postcards of the old frontier or in stories told by wrinkled men on porches, not in a war of panthers and Shermans, of dive bombers and rockets. To see them in Italy in 1943 was to be reminded that the world was older and more stubborn than any general's timetable. To see them and dismiss them was the natural reflex of men who trusted machinery more than muscle. What the Germans did not see, at least not clearly, was the other half of the picture. The roads that no longer existed, the trucks abandoned in ditches, the tanks that could not climb stone staircases cut into the sides of mountains centuries earlier by farmers and shepherds. They did not see what Harker had seen in the weeks leading up to that mocking pantomime. The convoys blown apart at harrowing bends, the men huddled beside stalled engines while mortar shells walked up a road like invisible giants, the crates of ammunition rotting in depots because nothing with an engine could get them where they were needed in time. After his first week in Italy, Harker had stood beside a shattered truck whose canvas top was soaked with blood and rain and diesel fuel and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, roads are lies out here, lines on a map, promises no one can keep. He had grown up with animals, on a farm in the hills of Kentucky, where the earth turned to rock just beneath the soil, and no tractor his father could ever afford would have worked the steepest fields. They had used mules there, stubborn, big-shouldered creatures with intelligent eyes and a talent for outlasting weather. As a boy, he had learned the feel of a halter rope in his hand, the trick of leaning against a bulking mule's shoulder, not yanking on its head, talking to it low and steady until it decided the fight wasn't worth it that day. He had carried those memories with him into the army, almost as an embarrassment, a relic of a past that smelled of hay and sweat and manure, a world away from V8 engines and artillery tables. In the mud of Italy, those memories stopped being quaint and started being relevant. The first time a staff officer mentioned pack artillery, it had been almost apologetic, a side comment in a smoky room where maps and cigarettes competed for space on the tables. "There is another option," the man had said, tapping at a contour line that rose into tight circles of elevation. "There are mule companies still available. We used them in the mountains before. The British too. They move light guns by pack. It's old-fashioned, but the terrain," the word had hung there, old-fashioned, like a bad smell. "Christ," a younger officer had snorted. "You want us to fight Rommel with mules now? This isn't the desert," the staff man had replied quietly. "It's worse." His fingers moved along the map, tracing valleys and ridges. "Look here, the enemy batteries sit here, here, and here. They have roads to them. On this side, we don't. We can't drag a 105 up these slopes with trucks. We've tried. We know how that ends. But 4 mules can carry a 75mm gun in pieces. 8 more can carry shells. Men can climb where trucks cannot. Gravity is a weapon, gentlemen. We just need to put our guns on top of it." No one laughed in that room. Not exactly. They shifted. They frowned. They grunted. Some looked interested, some skeptical. The war had a way of grinding down prejudice under the weight of necessity. When command approved an experiment, a single battery of pack artillery, supplied by a small battalion of mules and their handlers, no one pretended it was glamorous. It was a stopgap, a patch on a broken system. For Harker, it was a promotion. The farm boy who knew how to read the language of ears and hooves found himself transferred from a regular field artillery unit to an outfit where the supply room stocked nosebags and horseshoes as carefully as shell fuses. He met Italian muleteers with faces carved by wind and hunger, men who had been coaxing beasts up these slopes long before anyone thought to put an eagle or a star on a uniform. He listened as they spoke, their hands drawing maps in the air of trails invisible on Allied charts. Names like Pietro and Marco and Gianni joined the roll call alongside Smith and Johnson and Korsky. The first marches were disasters. Men used to marching on roads discovered what it meant to march on goat tracks in full kit, boots slipping on mossy rock, thighs burning, lungs gasping in air that seemed too thin to feed the fire in their muscles. Mules balked at bridges improvised from planks and barrels. Loads slipped. One crate of shells went bounding down a slope like a drunken coffin, scattering men and hurled curses in its path before it shattered against a boulder, mercifully without detonating. Rain came in sideways, turning stones slick and soil to liquid. But slowly, under the relentless pressure of repetition, chaos turned into a pattern. The men learned when to double-space the column on a dangerous stretch so that one panicked mule wouldn't take 5 with it. They learned to wrap loads so they didn't sway. They learned to read the weather, the way the clouds bunched and the wind turned before a mountain storm, and to time their ascents in the breathing spaces between the sky's tantrums. Above all, they learned to trust the animal's instincts more than their own sense of what seemed reasonable or safe. Watch their ears, Harker told his men on the 3rd or 4th climb that month, breath coming in clouds as they paused on a narrow ledge. They know what's under their feet better than we do. If they stop, you don't yank, you check. Maybe they see something you don't. You talking about mules or officers? Someone puffed, and the laughter, even ragged, helped. Down below, the war went on in its brutal, mechanized rhythm, artillery barrages, tank duels, infantry creeping from ditch to ditch. Up here, on the unforgiving slopes where engines died, another war was being fought inches at a time, hoof length by hoof length, guided by curses and whistles, and the occasional gentle pat on a sweating neck. Word of the pack artillery's first successes trickled through the grapevine of rumor and official reports. A gun emplaced on a hill the enemy thought too steep to matter had caught a supply column in enfilade and chewed it to pieces. Another battery, hauled by mules through ravines and olive groves, had been turned on a German observation post that had survived weeks of conventional bombardment. Its angle of approach so unexpected that the first shells landed before the observers even recognized the new trajectory. Still, the overall line held. Italy was a slow grind. For every foothold taken, there was another ridge, another river, another fortified farmhouse with machine gun ports carved into its stone walls. In some sectors, the entire front seemed frozen, a tableau of mud and wire and wary eyes staring through scopes at tree lines that hid death. It was on one of these frozen segments, just as winter began to settle its teeth into the mountains, that the plan took shape for something bigger. The German line there straddled a valley shaped like a crooked funnel. At the narrow end, near the Allied positions, a shallow river wriggled over stones slick with algae, reflecting the weak sun like dull tin. At the wide end, the valley opened into a bowl whose rim was formed by a series of hills and rocky spurs. On one of those heights, the Germans had built a position that the Allied infantry called the Nest, half in grudging admiration and half in hatred. The Nest was a cluster of bunkers and dugouts carved into the slope, protected by contours that made traditional artillery fire slide off like water. From it, German observers could peer down at the approaches, directing mortars and machine guns to catch any attempt to cross the valley in a crossfire. 3 times the Allies had tried frontal assaults, and 3 times the men had been driven back or cut to pieces before they could reach the lowest wire entanglements. The Nest sat there, smug and solid, its concrete teeth bared. Destroying it became an obsession. In a low, smoky room that smelled of damp wool, coffee, and the sour tang of too many men breathing the same air, a group of officers gathered around the map that showed the Nest and its surrounding ridges. Thin plumes of cigarette smoke trailed upward like ghosts of the men already lost, trying to dislodge it. "We hammer it from here," said one American major, stabbing a gloved finger at a battery symbol on their side of the valley. "We've done that. Results are negative. Their overhead cover is too good, and the angle is too flat. They just button up and wait it out." "We could bring heavier guns," suggested another. "And put them where?" asked a British liaison, his voice dry as the paper under his hand. "We'd have to move them in range. They'll see the movement, smash the roads, and we've accomplished nothing except creating more wrecks on the verges." "So we go around," someone else said. "Hit it from behind. With what? Mountain goats?" The sarcasm sounded tired rather than cruel. In the corner of the room, Harker leaned over his notebook, feeling the rough paper under his fingers. He wasn't supposed to speak unless asked. The plan, if there was going to be one, would come from higher up. Still, he found himself tracing the contour lines in his mind, imagining the valley as he had seen it through binoculars, the folds of earth, the ravines, the hidden shelves of rock where scrub clung in defiance of gravity. "What about the North Ridge?" asked a colonel finally, tapping at a thin line that climbed to a sharp elbow above the Nest. "From here?" Another officer shook his head. "Too steep. We scouted it. Barely fit a patrol up there." "Barely fit men," the colonel said. His eyes, sharp in a face lined by sleeplessness, lifted toward Harker. "But what about mules, Sergeant?" The room turned a little toward him, like a compass needle toward true north. Harker swallowed, feeling suddenly as if the walls had closed in. He stepped closer to the table, the map's creases casting tiny shadows in the lamplight. "Sir, mules can go where men can go, sometimes where men can't. can't. They don't like it, but they can. If we cut the loads down, take the guns apart into smaller packs, we can maybe get a section up there. 2 guns at most. How long? Someone asked. He thought of the slope, the distance, the weather that liked to roll in just when everyone thought the day might stay clear. He thought of mules balking at narrow passes, of men whose legs already ached from months of climbing. 2 nights, maybe 3, sir. Moving slow, no lights. If the weather holds and we don't lose an animal. He hesitated, then added, and if the guides know the trails. We have guides, said the British officer. Locals, partisans. These mountains are their home. 2 guns, muttered another major, as if tasting a number too small to swallow. We need more than 2 to crack that thing. 2 guns in the right place, the colonel replied. Might do more than 12 in the wrong place. Sir, he added, turning to his superior, if we can place artillery here. His finger tapped just above the nest where the ridge bent like a knuckle. We can fire down on them. Their overhead cover won't help. Their trenches become bathtubs. Their communication trenches become alleys. Their reverse slopes turn into killing grounds. And their officers, murmured someone, would have some explaining to do. There was a brief, bitter chuckle at that, as if the thought of German embarrassment were a small, hard candy. Many of them wanted to suck for a moment. Then the room settled into serious silence. Calculations began, ammunition allotments, mule availability, weather forecasts compiled by men peering at clouds and instruments that did not care about human desperation. Harker answered questions about load weights, about how many shells a mule could reasonably carry without breaking down, about how many men would be needed to keep a single gun running in a position where every resupply would be a minor expedition. In the end, the plan that emerged was as simple and as insane as many plans in that war. Under cover of bad weather and the routine chaos of the front, a detachment of pack artillery and mule trains would peel away from their usual routes and disappear into the northern hills. Guided by partisans, they would follow paths that existed only in the memories of shepherds and smugglers. They would climb above the nest, inch by inch, until they reached a shelf of rock where a 75mm gun could be reassembled and sighted. Then, on a dawn agreed upon by more hopeful men than wise ones, artillery would speak from a place the Germans did not even consider possible. No one put it in those terms, of course, in the formal orders. The documents spoke of enfilading fire and improved observation and surprise effect. But among the men who would actually make it happen, another, simpler phrase passed between them in muttered conversations and dark humor. We're going to make the nest look up, Korsky said, grinning without much joy as he tightened a strap on a mule's pack. They've been looking down at us long enough. The climb began on a night when the sky felt too low. Clouds dragged their bellies along the mountaintops, sprinkling fine, cold drizzle that soaked into wool and chilled fingers to numbness. The air smelled of wet stone and the faint metallic scent of snow that had not yet fallen, but promised itself in the sting on the skin. The column moved without lights, each man a darker shadow in the dark, each mule a hulking presence that took shape at the edge of vision and loomed suddenly close. The world shrank to the circle of sound around each pair, the rasp of breath, the soft grunt of effort, the click of hoof on stone, the occasional whispered curse. Harker walked near the head of the column, his hand on Rosie's halter, feeling the animal's steady strength. Behind him, a partisan named Luca slipped along like a ghost, his boots finding footholds without hesitation. Luca's face, when they had seen it in daylight, was cut by deep lines despite his youth. War and hunger had done their work. Now only his eyes seemed truly alive, flickering quickly from ground to shadow to the murk above, reading the mountain's moods as a sailor reads the sea. Here, Luca murmured in Italian-accented English after a while, touching Harker's arm and angling them toward a barely visible notch between 2 slabs of rock. Path goes there, narrow, one at a time. Narrow turned out to mean a ledge so thin that Harker could feel the void beside him like a living thing. The darkness below had weight. It tugged at his mind even as his boots felt for each solid patch. The mule's body was a warm wall between him and the drop, its hooves finding purchase seemingly by instinct. Somewhere further back, a stone skittered into the abyss, and a man hissed, "Jesus," before biting off further words. The column paused, held in place by the fear of a single misstep, then resumed its inching crawl. They climbed until their legs shook. They rested where they could, backs pressed against damp rock, mules standing with heads lowered, flanks heaving, steam rising faintly from their bodies into the cold air. They chewed dry, tasteless biscuits, washed down with water that tasted of metal. They did not risk fires. The night was a blanket of black shot with fine needles of rain. At some point, hours in, snow began to fall. Not thick, not yet, but in restless flurries that stung their cheeks cheeks and settled in the folds of their uniforms before melting into fresh cold. Harker's fingers, wrapped around the halter rope, went from numb to aching to something beyond, a dull awareness that they existed only because they hurt. He thought of Kentucky winters, of frost on fence posts, and the smell of hay in the barn, and pushed the memory aside before it could grow teeth and become homesickness. In the deep hours when the world felt hollow, a mule slipped. The sound was a sudden scrabble of hooves, a jangle of metal, a guttural cry from the animal. Harker's heart lurched as he twisted, trying to see past the shapes behind him. A flood of curses in English and Italian filled the dark. The column jolted to a halt. "Hold them! Hold them!" someone hissed. There was the thud of a body hitting rock, the grunt of air leaving a man's lungs. The mule's braying filled the narrow passageway, high and panicked. Stones clattered away into nothingness. Harker could feel Rosie tense, ears flicking back, muscles bunching with the urge to spin and bolt. "Easy," he whispered, pressing his shoulder into her neck, feeling the tremors there, the racing heart under the hide. "Easy, girl. Stand." The mule that had slipped did not fall. Two men, braced like human chalks, had thrown themselves against its flanks, pinning it to the slope, one arm thrown around its neck as if embracing a terrified relative. In the end, the animal's hooves found purchase again, scraping against rock, breath wheezing. The gun barrel section it carried had swung wildly, its weight threatening to drag the mule over the edge, but leather had held. One strap had snapped. They retied it with stiff, clumsy fingers. "Next time," muttered the man who had nearly gone over with the mule, his face pale and sweaty in the dark, "we bring wings instead of mules." No one laughed. The relief was too sharp, edged with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing not just an animal and a piece of a gun, but the fragile, winding path of the entire operation. By the time the sky began to pale, they had covered only a fraction of the planned distance. Luca shook his head as he checked the ridgeline, his breath forming brief ghosts in the cold air. "We stop here," he said, too exposed in daylight further up. "The Germans watch from those peaks. They have glasses. If we move now, they see. We wait until dark again." They huddled in a hollow scooped out of the slope by centuries of wind and water, men and mules packed together for warmth. The animals' bodies radiated a dense, living heat, a reminder that the guns and shells strapped to their backs depended on muscle and heartbeat rather than pistons and spark plugs. Some of the soldiers dozed in jerks and starts, heads bobbing against their packs, hands still curled around ropes and rifle slings. Others simply stared into the mist, eyes bloodshot and gritty, listening to their own thoughts march in circles. Down in the valley, the nest watched the world below with its habitual suspicion. Major Ernst Kappel, commander of the German artillery in that sector, stood in his bunker doorway and breathed in the morning air. It was cold and clean, washed by the night's drizzle, carrying the smells of pine and damp earth and wood smoke from the kitchen shelters. The concrete walls around him were painted in muted tones that merged with the rock, dotted with the marks of where shrapnel had tested their strength and failed. Above, camouflage netting and cut branches blurred the outlines. He cradled a mug of ersatz coffee in his hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. In the valley below, through his binoculars, the enemy lines were a smudge of muted brown and gray, pocked here and there by the white scars of shell holes. Nothing moved in the open. They had learned. "Morning, Herr Major," said Oberleutnant Weiss, his second in command, stepping out beside him and stretching, joints popping under his uniform. His face was pale, with the kind of early morning softness that had not yet rearranged itself into the harder mask he wore under fire. "Quiet night. Quiet is never a blessing here," Kappel replied, raising the binoculars again. "It means they are thinking." Weiss chuckled. "They think a lot and still run into our fire. Perhaps they should think less." Kappel did not answer immediately. He had seen enough to know that contempt was as dangerous as any enemy weapon. Still, a certain complacency had crept into the nest. They had beaten back every attack so far. Their gun crews were experienced. Their observers knew every fold of the ground by memory. The men had begun to decorate their dugouts with little paintings and bits of stolen Allied kit, trophies of a defensive success. A sign hung in one bunker, painted in black letters on a scrap of wood. "Willkommen in der Nest. Eintritt nur auf eigene Gefahr." Welcome to the nest. Enter at your own risk. "The mules are back, Herr Major," Weiss said, lifting his own binoculars and scanning the lower slopes on the enemy side. "There, on the road, like a circus." Kappel turned his glasses in that direction. Sure enough, a column of dull shapes wound along a switchback road well behind the front, each animal burdened with bulky loads. Tiny figures moved alongside them, sticks in their hands, guiding and prodding. Even at this distance, the rhythm of hooves was almost visible in the way the line flexed. Weiss gave a brief snort of amusement. "They want to conquer Europe with donkeys now," he said. "First the mechanized superpower arrives, and now this. Maybe next they bring elephants." Donkeys are stubborn, Capel said, though his mouth twitched at the corners. Perhaps that is why they like them. It is not the animals that worry me. It is who leads them. Pack units, Weiss said dismissively. Old-fashioned. If they had real roads, they would not need such things. Yes, Capel lowered his binoculars and sipped his coffee. If they had real roads. They watched for a while longer. The mule column turned behind a hill and vanished. There was nothing extraordinary in it. Supplies had to move one way or another. The nest had bigger concerns than a line of four-legged anachronisms. Their guns had calibers to maintain, fuses to check, ammunition to count and recount in the dwindling stockpiles. Somewhere, higher up the chain, men in warmer rooms were arguing about where the next line would be if this one failed. Capel's duty was simple in comparison. Hold here as long as possible. Make the enemy pay. If he had any nagging thoughts about mules and mountains, he pushed them aside. The enemy guns were where they always were, in rehearsed positions across the valley. His map told him that. His experience confirmed it. The possibility that somewhere above him, men and animals were inching their way into a new configuration of threats did not feature in his mental picture. Above the nest, the pack column resumed its climb with the coming of the second night. The air grew thinner. Breath came harder. Snow, which had flirted with them the previous night, now committed itself more fully, swirling in erratic flurries that dusted rock and hat brims alike. The world in their lanternless ascent was a monochrome of gray and black, and the occasional flash of white where snow clung to a branch or a ledge. Harker's thighs burned constantly now, a dull fire that had settled in and made itself at home. The rope in his hand felt like an extension of his arm. Rosie climbed without complaint, though her ears flicked back more often, and her steps paused at each unfamiliar texture. At one point, the trail forced them to cross a shallow gully where water had trickled and frozen in thin sheets. The ice was treacherous, practically invisible under a dusting of snow. Luca tested each step with a stick, tapping before he committed his weight. Harker followed, feeling the soles of his boots slide by fractions, trusting that the hobnails could bite just enough. The mule's hooves rang against the ice, a sharp, bright note in the muffled soundscape. When they finally reached the shelf that Luca had promised, it did not look like the sort of place where a gun belonged. It was a long, relatively flat expanse of rock tilted slightly toward the valley, like a balcony built by a careless giant. Sparse shrubs scratched at its surface, their branches twisted by wind. Frost glittered in shallow depressions. Beyond its edge, the land dropped away in a steep slope that tumbled down toward the nest, whose positions were now almost directly below, hidden from sight by the angle but very present on the map in Harker's head. "We are here," Luca said simply, his voice a rasp. He lifted his hand and pointed. "The nest is there. You fire from here. You put shells into their backs." Harker turned slowly, taking it in. The space was narrower than he'd hoped, wider than he'd feared. There was room for 2 guns, maybe 3 if they were willing to live dangerously. There was almost no cover. They would have to build revetments from stone, sandbags hauled up one miserable load at a time. Each gun emplacement would be like a tooth hammered into the mountain. He could feel, through the soles of his boots, the weight of the geography. Gravity, he thought, echoing the staff officer, is a weapon. We're standing on the trigger. They began, bone-tired though they were, to unload. The guns came apart like puzzles in reverse. Barrels slid out of cradles, carriages disassembled, trails separated into manageable chunks. Men with fingers clumsy from cold and exhaustion unbuckled straps, lifted metal from animal backs, staggered under the weight, and carried each piece to its provisional place on the rocky shelf. The sound of metal on stone was dull and heavy. Mules shook themselves, relieved of their burdens, sides heaving. "Careful," Harker urged, his voice hoarse. "If you drop that muzzle, I'll make you carry it back down by yourself to get a new one." There were no lights. They worked by feel when they had to, by the weak wash of starlight when the clouds parted. Time lost meaning. The tasks broke into a series of specific actions, each one requiring full concentration. Bolt here, pin there, elevation gear in place, traversing mechanism checked. The familiar shapes of the guns emerged from the chaos of parts, low silhouettes against the night. By the time the first pale smear of dawn touched the far horizon, 2 75mm pack howitzers sat on the shelf, their barrels angled downward toward an enemy that did not yet know they were there. Crude stone walls, barely knee-high in places, ringed them in incomplete circles. Shells lay stacked nearby, ammunition crates already dusted with frost. Harker wiped a hand across his face and felt grit and sweat and cold moisture. His eyes burned. He could hear, beneath the noises of men shifting and coughing, the steady tired shuffling of the mules as they turned to face away from the wind. "Get what rest you can," he told his crew. He glanced at the lightening sky, did a rough calculation. "You've got a few hours before we start in earnest. Eat something if you can find it in your pockets, then close your eyes. I want you awake when we open up." "Sergeant," Korsky said quietly, as the others drifted toward boulders and patches of scrub to curl around their exhaustion. "You think this is going to work?" Harker looked out over the valley. From here, the German lines seemed less like a separate world and more like an object laying in front of them on a table. The slopes of the nest's hill were subtle curves and angles, the kind of geometry that artillery manuals tried to capture with diagrams, but never quite could. He could imagine shells falling there, at steeper angles than the Germans expected, plunging down into places they considered safe. "I think," he said slowly, "that if we're ever going to make them stop laughing at those mules, this is it." Dawn fully unfurled itself, coloring the world in austere shades of gray and blue. Mist pooled in the valley, clinging to the streams and hollows like breath. From the nest, Capel and his men began their day much as they had others. Guns were checked, sights were cleaned, ammunition was inventoried. A sentry stamped his feet on a frozen guard post and dreamt of a stove somewhere. Kitchen smoke rose in thin streams, carrying the smell of watery soup and charred bread. On the Allied side, at prearranged times, other batteries in the valley cranked their guns onto new bearings. Infantry units shifted slightly, as if stretching before a race. Radios crackled with terse confirmations. In a dugout somewhere far from the mountain shelf, a commander checked his watch and thought of calendars, of dates circled by planners and altered by reality. Up on the shelf, Harker's battery came awake as if rising from some joint, shallow grave. "On your feet," he urged, clapping cold, stiff shoulders. "Move. Get blood in your legs. The Germans aren't going to feel sorry for us if we cramp up." The men rose, groaning, stamping. Breath smoked from their mouths. Gloves were flexed, shoulders rolled. The mules stood in a cluster, ropes looped to rocks, ears twitching at unseen irritations. One of them let out a long, resigned sigh that sounded almost human. Harker moved to the nearest gun, running his hands along its familiar lines. He checked the breech, the recoil system, the elevation wheel. His fingers knew what they were looking for even when his eyes, gritty with fatigue, did not. Around him, the gun crew took their positions with the efficiency of constant drill layered over the clumsiness of cold and altitude. A runner scrambled up from a lower observation point, breath burning in his lungs, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. He thrust a folded paper into Harker's hand. "Fire plan, Sergeant." Harker unfolded it, smoothing the damp, crinkled sheet with his thumb. Numbers and grid references stared back at him, the abstract representation of very concrete places where very real men stood. The first salvos would walk across known machine gun nests and mortar pits, trying to suppress them. Then, when the enemy responded, the pattern would shift to catch the paths they used to move. He looked up, orienting himself to the valley below. The nest was invisible from here, masked by the steepness of the slope immediately beneath his gun, but he knew, from the map and from Luca's assurances, that the shells they fired from this improbable balcony would come down on that cluster of concrete and earthworks, like steel rain from a new direction. "Elevation," he told the gunner, giving the first set of coordinates. "Deflection, load." The first shell slid into the breech with a heavy, oily kiss of metal. The loader's gloves squeaked against the casing. The breech block slammed shut with a meaty clank that sent a small vibration through the carriage. Men stepped back into their practiced positions. "On my command," Harker said. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind paused. "Fire!" For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the gun leaped against its restraints, the recoil system absorbing the kick with a violent shudder. The crack of the report punched Harker's eardrums, even through his mufflers. Muzzle flash bloomed in front of the barrel, briefly painting the rock face in harsh light. The smell of burnt powder rolled over them, hot and strangely sweet. Down below, the nest heard something it had never heard before. The sound reached them out of sequence, the echo ricocheting off surrounding heights in a confusing cascade. To Capel's practiced ear, the noise of a 75mm gun was familiar, as was the bark of Allied batteries in known positions. But this report, this angle, he found himself freezing for a heartbeat, mug halfway to his lips, as his brain tried to fit the sound into his mental map and failed. Then, the first shell landed. It came in steep, as if dropped by a wrathful hand. It hit just behind one of the forward bunkers, on a patch of ground previously considered safe, and detonated with a concussive thump that lifted earth and timber in a fountain of debris. Men who had been standing there, waiting their turn at the latrine, or sharing a cigarette in what had always been regarded as a blind spot, vanished in a spray of soil and splinters. A second shell followed, punching into the roof of a dugout dugout designed to take hits from flatter trajectories and punching straight through, converting the air inside into a storm of fragmentation. Alarms shrieked, voices shouted, men dove for cover that suddenly no longer felt like cover. The carefully rehearsed dance of responding to familiar artillery patterns unspooled. Someone tried to slam a door that no longer existed. Someone else, in a moment of denial, shouted that it had to be a stray mortar or an airburst gone wrong. Impossible, Weiss gasped, clutching the doorway as another shell crashed into a communication trench, turning the carefully dug path into a chaotic ditch. They can't have a battery up there. There's no road. In the bunker doorway, Capel shoved past him, binoculars forgotten around his neck. He looked up, squinting against the glare of dust and the sudden smoky haze that drifted across the slope. He saw only rock and scrub and sky, the same teeth of the mountain that had been there yesterday and the day before. But the sound kept coming, each report followed by a new blossom of destruction somewhere further back in his positions. Roads, he heard himself say, without meaning to. He had been thinking about roads all morning, in an abstract way. Now the word tasted different. They don't need roads. His officers scattered, shouting orders. Gun crews rushed to their pieces, trying to track this new source of fire. But the trajectory was so steep, the shelf so close and so high above them, that their own artillery struggled to angle their barrels upward far enough, their sighting mechanisms ill-suited to such a near-vertical duel. Mortars were swung around, tubes elevated to ridiculous angles. Even then, the valley's sides complicated calculations. Rounds meant for the unseen shelf burst too low or too high, fragments whining harmlessly into empty air. On the mountain, Harker's crew worked like a machine that had been wound too tight. On target! Drop 50! The spotter's voice crackled in his earphones, wind and static and adrenaline in the mix. Below them, small figures darted between the shell bursts, seeking new cover, abandoning trenches that had felt like home. We're walking them right through their rear works. Drop 50, Harker repeated. Fire. Shells slammed into ammo storage pits that had been sighted with confidence behind the crest, sending secondary explosions rocketing skyward. A bizarre reverse thunder of fire blooming upward rather than dropping down. Logs that had seemed substantial when placed to shore up roofs shattered like matchsticks. A field kitchen, its crew already scrambling, took a direct hit, and the smell of soup and burning flesh rolled together into a sickening wave that drifted up the slope. From above, it was difficult to see individual men. War at this distance translated human lives into flickers and movement. Harker knew, in a way that lived in his bones, that each puff of dust or black plume of explosion meant bodies broken or gone, but he could not focus on that now. His world was numbers and commands, the feel of the gun beneath his hands, the rhythm of load, fire, recoil, repeat. Rosie and the other mules stood tethered a little way back, ears pricked nervously, eyes rolling at each concussion. Their flanks quivered with each blast. They had carried the guns here, and now they could only watch as the weapons they had delivered did the work of unmaking the valley below. In the nest, the laughter that had once greeted the sight of mule trains was replaced by something close to panic. Men shouted questions no one could answer. Where was the enemy battery? Had they somehow brought a gun up by air? A glider? Had they burrowed through the mountain like some kind of monstrous worm? The more practical among them wasted no time on speculation. They simply did what soldiers always did under fire. They tried to survive. They dragged wounded comrades into whatever cover remained. They crawled from shattered dugouts to less shattered ones. They tried to re-establish lines of communication that had been severed by explosions. Capel found himself on the phone, his voice pitched lower than he expected, speaking rapidly to a higher headquarters that demanded explanations he did not have. No, Herr Oberst, I do not know exactly where they are, he said, forcing calm into his words. But the trajectory is steep. It must be a position above us, on the north ridge. Yes, I understand that there is no road. I am telling you what the shells tell me. Yes, sir, he added after a pause. They are firing into our rear works. Yes, sir, the nest is compromised. The word tasted like defeat. Outside, another shell struck, close enough to send dust showering down from the segmented ceiling of the command dugout. The electric bulb swung wildly on its cord. Somewhere, someone screamed, a thin, high sound that cut through the deeper rumble of blasting earth. On the shelf, Harker could feel the slight shifting in the pattern of enemy return fire. Mortar rounds began to land closer, their bursts sending shards of rock hissing across the shelf. One fragment sang past his ear, close enough to stir the hair there. Another shattered against the stone revetment in front of the gun, showering the crew with splinters. One man hissed as a shard sliced through his sleeve, opening a bloody stripe along his forearm. "They're trying to find us!" Korsky shouted over the noise, grinning with a kind of wild glee that masked the fear in his eyes. "That means we're hurting them," Harker shouted back. "Keep firing!" The guns hammered. Shell after shell arced downward into the nest, each one a punctuation mark in a grim sentence being carved into the hillside. The nest, which had once felt to its garrison like an impregnable fortification, a place from which they could watch others bleed, was transformed into a slaughterhouse. Trenches designed to catch bullets now collected shrapnel and collapsing earth. Overhead cover, optimized against flat trajectory shells, became traps that channeled fragmentation downward when struck from above. As the bombardment continued, Allied infantry at the valley's edge began their attack. They moved forward in short rushes, hunched against the familiar rattle of machine gun fire from surviving German positions. But something was different. The guns that had once swept the open ground with deadly regularity were fewer, their bursts less sustained. Some nests had been obliterated by the new artillery angle. Others were manned by shaken crews whose nerves were frayed by the feeling of being hunted from above. "Go, go, go!" shouted a lieutenant, waving his men forward. Mud sucked at their boots. The air was thick with cordite and the sour stink of churned soil. Above them, the mountain guns kept up their work, like distant gods hurling thunderbolts into the heights. From his vantage point on the shelf, between adjustments and shouted commands, Harker caught glimpses of the infantry's advance. Tiny figures bobbing forward, dropping to knees, rising again. Some did not rise. Others reached patches of ground that had always been death zones before and kept moving, the enemy fire slackening or silenced by the plunging shells. "Shift fire," came the order from the observation post. "Lift off the forward bunkers, hit the reverse slope. They're pulling back." Harker relayed the command. The gun's angle changed, just a few degrees, but enough to move the shell impacts further up and behind the nest. The Germans who had survived the initial barrage and now tried to retreat, stumbling up communication trenches or scrambling over the back of the hill, found that their routes were now catchment areas for explosions. The nest was no longer a shield, it was a bowl catching steel rain. In the chaos between one shell and the next, Major Capel emerged from his dugout and stared up the impossible slope above his mangled positions. For a moment, through a gap in the smoke, he thought he saw movement on a shelf of rock far, far above. The brief silhouette of a gun recoiling, the suggestion of men around it, the tiny dark shapes of animals behind. The image was gone almost immediately, obscured by dust and the next flash. But it was enough. Mules, he thought, with a clarity that bordered on absurdity. They brought guns up, with mules. He remembered the laughter in the mornings, the casual jokes around the coffee about donkeys and circus trains. He remembered the certainty in his own mind that there were places on these mountains where war simply could not reach, where gravity and inclination carved out a kind of absolute sanctuary for those who held them. Now that certainty cracked under the weight of reality. He shouted something, an order, perhaps, or a warning, but the words were swallowed by the roar of another explosion that ripped the air just meters away. The world turned white and red and black in rapid succession. Hours later, when the smoke began to thin and the echo of artillery diminished to an occasional distant thump, the nest was no longer recognizable as the confident bastion it had been. Its trenches were choked with rubble and bodies. Bunkers gaped open where their roofs had collapsed inward. The sign over the entrance, with its jaunty warning, lay face down in the mud, its painted letters splintered. Survivors, some wounded, some simply in shock, uniforms gray with dust and smoke, stumbled among the ruins like ghosts. Allied infantry began to appear on the slopes, cautious and gun-ready, moving from cover to cover. They met resistance in pockets, short, desperate firefights erupting around isolated positions where small groups of Germans refused to yield. But the cohesion was gone. The nest, as an organism, had been killed by the guns on the shelf. On that shelf, the silence after the last ordered salvo felt almost unreal. Harker stood with his hands on the cooling barrel of the nearest gun, feeling the residual warmth through his gloves. His ears rang in the aftermath, the world distant and muffled. His throat tasted of smoke and copper. Around him, men sagged where they stood, or leaned against whatever solid surface was available. Faces were smudged with soot and dust, eyes reddened. Below them, tiny specks of movement marked the Allied foothold in what had once been an untouchable enemy strongpoint. It was hard to connect the two, the pounding of their guns and that small, stubborn crawling of men up broken slopes. But he knew they were linked as surely as cause and effect. Rosie and the other mules shifted restlessly, sensitive to a change they could not name. The sky had cleared somewhat, revealing a brittle blue stretched over the scarred landscape. The cold bit more sharply now that the work had paused, and the blood in their veins had a chance to notice how far they were from any hearth or stove. "Sergeant," Korsky said, his voice still raised a bit too loud over the fading ring in his ears. "You see them? The Germans? Running the wrong way?" Harker squinted. It was hard to tell who was who at this distance. Uniforms blurred by mud and distance, but he saw shapes moving away from the nest's hill, not toward it. He saw arms raised in surrender, small white flags improvised from bandages or scraps of cloth. He saw, in short, what retreat looked like when seen from above. Disorder. Yeah, he said quietly. I see them. He thought of the German officers in the orchard months ago, their mocking gestures. He wondered, with a flicker of dark curiosity, whether any of them had been in the nest that morning, whether any surviving officer now looked up at the ridge with a new kind of respect for the animals and men they had underestimated. No one held a parade for the mules when they began, days later, the long process of hauling shells and supplies up to newly established positions on the captured heights. The official reports that filtered back through the chain of command spoke of innovative employment of pack artillery and exploitation of mountainous terrain. Names were mentioned: colonels, majors, captains. The mules' names, if they were recorded at all, remained on the mouths of the men who led them: Rosie, Jack, Nero, Bella. In the weeks following the battle, as the front crept on to new ridges and new valleys full of their own fresh nightmares, the story of the nest circulated in mess tents and dugouts. The part that people remembered, when they told it between mouthfuls of lukewarm stew or drags of cigarettes, was simple. We had guns above them. They never saw it coming. Sometimes, when the weather pinned units in place and there was nothing to do but wait out the storm, someone would add the detail about the mules. There would be chuckles, some of them incredulous, some tinged with a new respect. Men who had never thought about animals as anything but food or background to their lives would nod slowly and say, "Guess you can't bomb a mule trail that isn't on any map." For Harker, the memory remained sharp, anchored in the feel of cold rope under his fingers, the sight of Rosie's ears pricked against the wind, the smell of gun smoke mixed with the earthy scent of sweating animals on a mountain ledge that had no business serving as an artillery platform. He would remember, years later, after the war and after the uniforms were folded away, the exact way the nest had looked from above, not in precise details, but in the impression of power reversed, of vantage points traded. He would also remember the quiet moments that came after the adrenaline, when he sat on a rock at the edge of the shelf and watched the evening light creep back into the valley. The thunder was gone by then, replaced by the small, practical sounds of soldiers building new dugouts, of mules cropping at scrubby tufts of grass, of someone humming tunelessly as they repaired a torn harness. Smoke rose from the battered remains of the nest in thin, resigned pillars. "Think they're still laughing at us?" Korsky had asked him once, coming to sit beside him, wiping his nose on the back of his glove. Harker had considered the question, looking out at the land that had cost so much to move forward a few thousand yards. "If they are," he'd said finally, "I hope they keep underestimating us. And the mules. That's how we get up here in the first place." Somewhere below, in a captured bunker that still smelled of German tobacco and cheap coffee, Major Ernst Kappel sat on an overturned crate, his arm in a sling. He listened to the unfamiliar rhythms of Allied voices echoing in what had once been his domain. In his mind, the sound of the morning's bombardment replayed in loops, always from that impossible angle. He found, to his own surprise, that the image that most haunted him was not of his men falling, or of bunkers collapsing, but of a distant, half-glimpsed silhouette of a mule on a ridge, a gun behind it, outlined against a pale sky. He would not speak of it in those terms in his report, of course. Pride and the formal language of the Wehrmacht did not allow for such admissions. But somewhere in his private ledger of the war, in a place where he kept track of the moments when his assumptions had failed him, he marked down a note. Never underestimate what an enemy will carry on his back, or on the back of a beast. The Italian campaign ground on, past that valley and its shattered nest, into other mountains and other killing grounds. New technologies came to the fore, new machines, new horrors, but mules would continue to climb where engines could not, hauling guns and shells and food and bandages and, sometimes, the wounded. They would stand quietly in the background of photographs where men posed with medals and flags, their presence so ordinary that few thought to mention it in captions. Years later, in quiet fields far from Italy, some of those mules would pull plows again or haul carts of hay. Others would live out their days in army depots, anonymous among rows of harnesses and feed bins. The men who had led them up impossible slopes would tell their children and grandchildren stories that focused on battles and famous names. But every now and then, perhaps when a horse snorted in a nearby field, or a wooden cart rattled over a country lane, they would find themselves saying, "You know, in Italy, we took artillery up mountains with mules. The Germans laughed at us, for a while, and somewhere, in the layered memory of those who had been there, the image would persist. A line of dark shapes climbing into the dawn, hooves striking sparks from rock, breath steaming, carrying on their backs the means to turn arrogance into ruin. Because in the end, on those cold Italian heights, it was not the flashiest weapons or the newest engines that changed that small corner of the war. It was gravity, stubbornness, and animals that cared nothing for maps or pride, only for the next step forward on a narrow, rocky trail.